In the year of our Lord 1315, the world seemed to pause beneath a pall of gray. Winters had always been cold and harsh, yet none could recall a chill so long, nor a sky so weary of light. Day after day, the sun rose as if burdened, and yet it cast but a pale and timid glow, scarcely warming the lands below. Villages that had flourished with golden fields now lay under frost, and the murmurs of men spoke of fear as much as wonder. It was a winter unlike any that had been remembered in the tales of elders. The rivers, once lively and full of fish, lay thick with ice. The animals, small and great alike, wandered the fields, confused and searching for sustenance that the frozen soil could no longer give. Men and women bundled in coarse wool, peering through frosted windows, wondered if the world itself had turned against them. Stories traveled slowly in those days, carried from village to village by weary travelers, monks, and merchants. The first whispers of a winter without sunlight were met with disbelief. How could the sun fail? How could the world shiver so endlessly, as if trapped beneath some invisible dome? And yet, as months passed, the tales became truths too heavy to deny. In the towns of France, the peasants murmured among themselves, while their bread grew thin and sour, for the fields had failed, and the harvest was lost beneath the frost. They spoke of rivers that no longer flowed, of livestock that fell ill, and of hunger that crept silently into homes. Some turned to prayer, others to superstition, and some simply gazed upward, seeking the sun that no longer seemed to care for their toil. Monks in the monasteries wrote of it in careful Latin, their quills scratching across parchment, as if to capture the memory before it was too late. "The sun is but a pale shadow," one scribe wrote, "and the light of God seems withdrawn." These words would travel slowly, carried on carts and by horseback, reaching ears that trembled at each passing day. And still the snow fell, and still the sun remained but a distant and weak flame, as if the world itself had forgotten how to glow. It was not only the land that suffered. The human heart, too, grew weary under this dim, enduring winter. Men who once labored in hope now labored in despair. Women who bore children whispered tales of famine to one another, their voices low and soft. Children, unused to such hardship, looked upon the sky and wondered if the sun had abandoned them forever. Kings and nobles attempted to maintain order, issuing commands and distributing the scant food that remained. Yet even their wealth could not shield them from the endless frost. The castles that once gleamed in sunlight now seemed gray and cold, towers like frozen sentinels, staring over lands that shivered and trembled. The wind blew relentlessly, carrying with it whispers of sorrow and the faint, mournful cries of those who had lost hope. This was not merely a season of hardship. It was a season of change, though none could yet see the shape of the world that would follow. The very soil seemed to harden against man's hand. Rivers and lakes, long held as steady and eternal, became obstacles instead of pathways. Crops, sown with care in spring, failed without mercy. And yet life persisted, stubborn as ever, in homes where fires burned low and families huddled together beneath woolen blankets. Travelers told stories of strange happenings in the countryside. Wolves moving closer to villages in search of food, birds falling from the sky, and a quiet stillness that pressed upon the land like a shroud. Some believed that the world itself mourned, grieving for sins committed long before. Others whispered of curses, of heaven's wrath, and of the end times. But still, life continued, slow and deliberate, beneath the weakened sun. The church attempted to soothe the hearts of the people, offering prayers and sermons to calm the fears that had taken root. Monks and priests reminded their congregations that hardship was part of the human condition, that patience and faith were virtues to endure even the darkest winters. Pilgrimages continued, though the roads were treacherous, and sermons were delivered in the shadow of frost-laden stones. Yet perhaps the most remarkable thing was the resilience of the human spirit. Even as food grew scarce and homes became cold, men and women sought small joys. A loaf of bread shared with neighbors, a fire lit with care, a child's laughter breaking the monotony of gray days. In this endless winter, the simple act of persistence became a quiet rebellion against despair, a reminder that the sun, though dim, was not wholly gone from the hearts of those who survived. And so the year passed slowly, with each day a muted echo of what should have been. The sun rose, if it could be called rising, and fell with little notice. Snow blanketed the land in a uniform hush, and life, though diminished, carried on. Men marked time by the frost, by the failing of their food, by the shifting of the ice on rivers once full of life. The people of 1315 would remember this winter not only for its cold, but for its quiet persistence, the way the world itself seemed to have paused in contemplation, and the endurance of those who lived through it. They told their children and their children's children that there was a time when the sun seemed to vanish, and yet the world went on. Thus began the chronicles of the year without sunlight, a winter that stretched across kingdoms, across lands, and across hearts. A winter that would become legend, whispered through the ages, not for the grandeur of battles or the rise of kings, but for the quiet, unyielding shadow that fell upon the earth, a reminder that even in darkness, life endures, patiently, stubbornly, softly, until the sun returns. As the year of endless gray pressed onward, the land itself seemed to weep beneath the cold. Fields that once bore wheat and barley now lay lifeless, their soil frozen as if the earth had drawn a blanket over its own sorrow. Farmers, who had tilled the soil since dawn broke over their villages, found their hands idle, their plows unmoving, the promise of harvest lost beneath the stubborn frost. The frost did not arrive suddenly. It crept in like a slow shadow, first touching the edges of rivers and ponds, then settling in the valleys, then creeping along the hillsides, until all of Europe seemed enveloped in a muted silver hush. At first, men called it an unusually long winter. Some even chuckled at the inconvenience, thinking spring would come soon enough. But the laughter faded, replaced by concern and dread as the frost lingered and multiplied. Villages in France and England spoke in hushed tones of fields that had failed for a second year in a row. The seeds they had planted in hope sprouted briefly, only to wither beneath the icy breath of the sky. Cows and sheep, hungry and confused, wandered across frozen pastures, their hooves breaking through brittle grass that no longer provided sustenance. Families, forced to ration what little grain remained, huddled together by meager fires, whispering prayers for relief that did not come. Even the great forests, ancient and dense, seemed subdued under the weight of the frost. Trees that once shook with the laughter of birds now stood silent, their limbs heavy with snow. Wolves roamed closer to human habitations than ever before, seeking prey that had grown scarce. The cold, relentless, and unyielding pressed on every living creature with a quiet cruelty, reminding all who dwelled upon the land that nature itself had grown tired. In towns along the rivers, merchants found their trade diminished. Goods rotted in warehouses as transport slowed under frozen roads and rivers. Markets, once lively and full of chatter, became muted. Only the whisper of coins changing hands remained to punctuate the oppressive quiet. Inns, though warm with fires, filled with travelers who had nowhere else to go, men and women weary from journeying through frostbitten paths. The smell of smoke mingled with the scent of wet wool and stale bread, and even these small comforts could not shake the shadow that had settled over the world. Some sought to understand the cause of this unending cold. Scholars in monasteries pored over their tomes, searching for omens or explanations. They wrote of sunspots and celestial alignments, of divine displeasure and earthly punishment. Letters traveled slowly, carried by horse and cart, detailing the frost's effects on distant lands. Reports spoke of frozen rivers in the Low Countries, of famine in the Alps, of frozen vineyards in Burgundy, where the grapes withered before they could even ripen. Yet knowledge did not bring solace. People prayed in vain, offering their last bread to the church, lighting candles for warmth in the darkness. Priests reminded their congregations that patience and faith were virtues, yet even their words seemed brittle under the oppressive cold. It was as if the frost had entered not only the land, but the hearts of men, chilling hope to a whisper. In the villages, children learned a different rhythm of life. Where once they chased each other through fields, now they walked carefully across icy lanes, balancing on frozen mud. Their games were simpler, quieter, forced by the constraints of frost. Parents taught them the value of patience, of careful sharing, of endurance. Every day was measured not by the rising of the sun, which now barely appeared, but by the small tasks that could be completed despite the cold. The nobility, too, felt the weight of the frost. Castles that had once commanded vast lands found their larders bare, their servants worried, their kitchens unable to produce the feasts of past years. Wealth, long thought a shield against misfortune, offered little comfort. Even the most fortified walls could not keep the cold at bay. Lords and ladies donned heavier furs, gathered in chambers with low ceilings, and spoke in quiet tones of what might come if this winter did not relent. Merchants and peasants alike told tales of villages that had been abandoned entirely. The frost drove men from their homes, seeking shelter in neighboring towns or monasteries, sometimes traveling weeks only to find that the frost had followed. In those empty villages, doors creaked on hinges frozen shut, and the silence of snow-covered streets was unbroken. The wind seemed to carry the voices of those who had departed, whispering through the icicles that hung like crystals from every eave. Food, perhaps the greatest challenge of all, became a precious treasure. Grain grew scarce, livestock weakened. Fish could not be caught from rivers frozen solid. Families survived on what could be stored, rationing slowly with a careful hand. Breads became thinner, soups thinner still, and hunger grew as quietly as the frost itself. Children grew lean, their cheeks hollowed by cold and lack of nourishment. Yet they continued to play in the snow, unaware fully of the hardships surrounding them. In some regions, the frost brought with it unusual phenomena. Rivers froze mid-flow, creating icy sculptures that glimmered in the dim light. Snow fell in sheets that piled high against doors, and yet, in the quiet, one could almost see beauty in the monotony. The world seemed slowed, as though time itself had been caught in the grip of ice. The sun, weak and pale, wandered across the sky, offering little warmth or light, yet even its faint presence reminded men that some measure of life remained. Communities adapted. They learned to preserve what they could. Fires were stoked with care, clothing layered in ways previously unnecessary. People found solace in small acts. A neighbor sharing a portion of grain, a child finding delight in a snowflake, a father carrying his family through drifts to safer ground. The frost was harsh, but it demanded patience, ingenuity, and quiet courage. And slowly, the people of 1315 learned that survival was not only a matter of strength, but of enduring the stillness that pressed upon them from every side. Though the frost stole much, it also revealed resilience. In its silence, people discovered the rhythm of waiting. They measured days not in sunlight, but in shared meals, in hours spent tending fire, in the careful preservation of hope. Even as the world seemed muted and frozen, humanity endured, quietly, stubbornly, softly, awaiting the return of warmth that might never come. And so the winter stretched on, each day a repetition of frost and hunger, yet each day also a testament to survival. The snow-covered fields, the frozen rivers, the icicle-laden roofs, all became part of a landscape where life persisted, patient and enduring, beneath the pale light of a sun that had lost its vigor. The year without sunlight continued its slow march, shaping hearts, lands, and souls alike. leaving behind a quiet legend of endurance, whispered in the frost and remembered by those who lived to see another day. As the sun remained pale above the frost-bound lands, a new shadow spread across the villages and towns of Europe. It was a shadow not of clouds or ice, but of hunger, slow, creeping, relentless. The frost had stolen the fields, the rivers, and the life they had sustained. Now it was taking from the stomachs and hearts of those who endured it. Families sat in cottages, their hearths struggling to burn dry wood, their pots filled with thin soups of grains and dried herbs. The aroma of bread was scarce, and even when baked, it was coarse, hard, and far from the warmth of a summer loaf. Parents broke what little they had into smaller portions for their children, measuring each bite, counting each grain. The air inside homes grew heavy with worry, as whispers of scarcity mingled with the cold. In the market squares, a quiet despair had taken root. Merchants no longer displayed abundant sacks of flour or baskets of vegetables. The empty stalls spoke of scarcity with a muted voice. Travelers moving between towns carried their own woes, recounting tales of frozen rivers, and failed harvests, of wolves prowling too near, and of neighbors who had left in search of food that could not be found. The stories, passed along from mouth to ear, built a tapestry of sorrow that seemed to stretch as endlessly as the frost itself. Children, unaware of the full gravity of their situation, often played in the snow, creating shapes and patterns, their laughter thin but persistent. Yet behind their games, there was a quiet awareness of hunger, a knowing that pulled at small bodies and hearts. Mothers tried to mask it, offering a slice of bread here or a spoon of thin broth there, while fathers trudged through the snow to find what little could be gathered or bartered. The frost had altered the very rhythm of life. Where once the seasons were marked by planting and harvest, by festivals and holy days, now the days blended together in monotony. Men rose each morning, trudged through frozen streets, and returned with little to show for their labor. The sun, already dim, offered no comfort. The long nights pressed upon them, unbroken and unyielding. Life became measured not by the passing of months, but by the slow accumulation of surviving moments. Monasteries, traditionally places of abundance and learning, felt the winter's cruel hand as well. Monks, who tended gardens and cared for the poor, found their stores depleted. Casks of wine and grains ran low. The gardens, normally verdant even in the cold, were locked in ice. Yet still they continued their service, feeding travelers and villagers alike with what they could spare. Their dedication became a quiet example of resilience, a reminder that even in famine, acts of care endured. In cities, the poorest suffered most. Narrow streets, crowded with those seeking warmth and shelter, echoed with murmurs of hunger. Families were forced to sell or trade possessions for a morsel of bread. Beggars, once few and unnoticed, multiplied in number as desperation spread. Yet even in these hard times, small acts of kindness persisted. A loaf shared quietly behind a door, a blanket offered to a shivering child, a comforting word exchanged amidst despair. These small gestures, though simple, became lifelines, sustaining hearts as well as bodies. Stories of hardship traveled across lands. Letters from distant villages spoke of entire fields covered in frost, of livestock that had perished, and of rivers that froze in mid-flow. Some letters carried warnings, others sorrowful accounts, and still others offered advice for survival. In every story, there was a lesson of endurance: to ration carefully, to guard the weak, to persevere in the face of a winter that had no end in sight. Even the nobility could not escape the hunger. Castles, once overflowing with stores and luxuries, found their pantries dwindling. Kitchens that had produced lavish feasts were now limited to soups, coarse bread, and the occasional preserved meat. The lords and ladies, accustomed to abundance, were forced to reckon with the harsh reality that wealth could not summon warmth or nourishment from frozen earth. Councils were held, rations distributed, Yet the frost and famine respected no title, no rank, and no power. The people turned to prayer more fervently than ever. Churches, with their stone walls and flickering candles, became places not just of worship, but of shared hope. Priests reminded their congregations that patience and faith were necessary virtues. Yet even prayers felt heavy under the weight of cold and hunger. The sun, barely rising, seemed indifferent to their pleas. Nights stretched long, silent, and cold, and the people learned that endurance was as important as devotion. In some remote villages, the hunger took on a strange rhythm. Families who once feasted in simple abundance now learned to eat sparingly, to store carefully, to measure each morsel with precision. Children learned that food was not to be wasted. Every scrap had value. Parents found that patience and ingenuity became necessary tools for survival. Recipes changed. Soups thickened with roots and herbs, bread baked from grains, collected from the smallest corners of fields, all designed to stretch what little remained. Travelers told tales of distant lands where hunger was even more cruel. Rivers frozen solid, forests barren, villages abandoned. Yet amidst the despair, there were stories of human ingenuity. Women and men finding hidden stores of grain, crafting tools to dig through frost, finding ways to thaw and preserve what little food remained. These small victories were celebrated quietly, like flickering candles in the night, brief moments of light in the long winter. The frost and hunger also shaped character. Where once pride might have ruled, humility now prevailed. Where once quarrels might have erupted, cooperation became essential. People learned the quiet power of sharing, of leaning on neighbors, of enduring together. The hunger beneath the snow was not merely a trial of body, but a test of spirit, one that few escaped without change. In towns along rivers that had once teemed with life, the frozen waters became both a barrier and a resource. Fishermen adapted, carving holes through ice to catch what little remained. Farmers, whose fields had failed, learned to rely on forests for roots, berries, and game. Children, forced from play, became quiet observers of survival, learning patience, skill, and endurance in ways that books could not teach. Even the landscape itself seemed altered by the hunger. Frosted hills appeared sharper, rivers glassy and immobile. Trees, stripped of leaves, stood as solemn witnesses to human struggle. Snow-covered fields reflected the pale light of the sun, creating a uniform silence that stretched across miles and months. In this stillness, the presence of hunger was felt more deeply, not in sudden pangs alone, but in the quiet emptiness that settled into every corner of the land. Yet even in despair, the human heart persisted. Small joys, small victories, and small acts of care endured. Bread shared, fire tended, water carefully conserved. These became the threads that held communities together. Stories were told in whispers by candlelight, recounting times of plenty, offering hope that the sun would return, that warmth would come again, that the frost and hunger, though mighty, would not last forever. Thus the year pressed on, relentless yet quiet. Hunger walked beside every villager, every traveler, every noble and peasant alike. It was a companion, unwelcome yet inseparable. And yet, through it all, life endured. Families adapted, communities survived, and hearts continued to beat beneath the frost. The year without sunlight, the winter of hunger and silence, became a slow, steady lesson in patience, endurance, and the quiet resilience of humanity. Even as the snow fell, even as the rivers froze, and even as stomachs ached, men and women learned that survival was not about abundance, but about persistence. It was about waking each day and finding the small measures of life worth preserving. It was about enduring quietly and patiently beneath the frozen heavens, waiting for the sun that had forsaken them to rise again. The frost continued, unrelenting, as the year of pale sunlight stretched onward. While peasants struggled to survive in villages frozen under snow, The castles of kings and nobles faced their own trials. Though walls rose high and stores were kept, the cold seeped in between stones and timber, and even the most fortified halls could not fully guard against hunger or frost. Lords and ladies, who had known luxury, now counted grain and measured firewood with care, learning lessons in patience previously foreign to them. The kitchens of great halls, once bustling with the preparation of feasts, now quieted to the low murmurs of slow work. Bread was baked sparingly, soups made from whatever vegetables and grains could be spared. The lavish displays of meat and wine disappeared, replaced by modest meals designed to stretch the stores as long as possible. Cooks, accustomed to abundance, learned to ration, to preserve, to plan for weeks with what once might have been a single day's provision. Castles became communities of vigilance and quiet endurance. Servants, knights, and nobles alike shared the burden of frost and hunger, each aware that no rank or title could shield them entirely. Hallways, usually echoing with the clatter of daily activity, now whispered with careful steps, measured movements, and muted conversation. Even the laughter of children, which had once filled towers and courtyards, became rare, replaced by the soft murmurs of concern. The frost also reshaped the duties of the lords. Lords sent out messengers to neighboring towns and villages, seeking news of crop conditions, river levels, and the state of trade. They organized distribution of what remained in granaries, ensuring that both their household and the surrounding communities could survive. Sometimes they provided firewood to peasants, sometimes grain, often with strict guidance on rationing. These acts, small though they seemed, became vital links between the haves and the have-nots, threads of survival woven carefully through the frozen lands. The clergy, in monasteries and churches, played an increasingly central role in the lives of all. Monks labored tirelessly to maintain stores, tend gardens, and feed travelers. Their quiet chants, performed at dawn and dusk, echoed through stone halls, filling the cold air with a sense of rhythm and stability. The clergy also provided counsel, comforting the frightened, advising on rationing, and reminding their charges that endurance was a virtue. In an age without much certainty, their words became anchors of calm. Monasteries were often more prepared for winter than villages, yet the frost pressed upon them as well. Gardens that had produced vegetables and herbs fell silent beneath the ice. Wells and small rivers froze, making water a difficult task to obtain. Bread and grains, carefully stored in cellars, were monitored and dispensed sparingly. Travelers, arriving after long journeys across frozen paths, were offered what little could be spared. The monasteries, though small and often isolated, became hubs of quiet resilience. The winter shaped not only survival, but human interaction. Where once quarrels and disputes might have been common over land or livestock, the frost and hunger encouraged cooperation. Villagers learned to share firewood, to divide the last loaf of bread among neighbors, to watch over each other's children. Small acts of kindness, previously unremarkable, now became lifelines, sustaining bodies and hearts alike. The social fabric of communities, fragile in times of comfort, strengthened under the quiet pressure of frost and scarcity. Even the clergy, though guides of faith, found themselves adapting. They traveled, carefully, to distribute food, to advise, to document what they witnessed. Chronicles were written in muted ink, recording the hardships, the resourcefulness, and the quiet heroism of those who endured. These manuscripts, later discovered, would speak of patience, courage, and resilience, lessons for generations that would never see such winters again. The nobility, while wealthier, could not ignore the suffering beyond their walls. Peasants who worked their lands were essential to continued survival. Without the labor of the villages, granaries would be empty, stores of firewood would diminish, and even the castles would feel the cold more sharply. Many lords organized patrols and couriers to ensure that the outer villages received enough provisions and that no one starved needlessly if help could reach them. Even as frost pressed outward, these measures created lifelines of care. Trade, once a constant pulse of daily life, slowed to a crawl. Roads became treacherous under frost and ice. Rivers, which had carried goods far and wide, froze into smooth, impassable barriers. Merchants and traders adapted with caution, carrying only what they could transport by sled or by foot. Markets became quiet, muted gatherings where small exchanges occurred rather than bustling displays of abundance. Coins clinked softly, not loudly. Bartering replaced luxury. Necessity replaced commerce. Even within the castles, lessons were learned slowly and painfully. Lords and ladies discovered that wealth, while a comfort, was not a shield. Servants, who had once performed simple chores without notice, now played critical roles in rationing, maintaining heat, and organizing stores. Children, once kept safe from the harsh realities of life, learned patience and restraint. Even nobles, accustomed to abundance and ease, discovered humility and adaptability in the face of frost that ignored titles and rank. Communication between distant regions became vital. Letters, carried by messengers across ice-bound roads, spoke of frost, hunger, and adaptation. Some described abandoned villages. Others shared methods of preserving grain or cultivating what little could grow. These letters, carefully penned, became lifelines of knowledge. What worked in one region could save lives in another. Though slow to travel, they ensured that wisdom and caution spread, softening the edge of winter's cruelty wherever possible. In towns, the shared struggle brought people closer. Neighbors, previously distant, now cooperated. Fires were tended collectively. Small food stores were pooled and divided. Craftsmen, unable to trade widely, focused on local needs, repairing tools, and creating small comforts for those nearby. Children, too young to understand famine fully, observed, learned, and assisted, carrying small pieces of wood or fetching water. Their education became practical, quiet, and necessary, shaping a generation aware of both hardship and resilience. The frost and hunger also inspired reflection. In quiet moments, families and individuals considered the fragility of life and the endurance of spirit. They saw how quickly the earth could deny comfort, how slowly yet inexorably hardship could press upon the strong and weak alike. Yet through all of this, humanity endured. They adapted, persisted, and discovered courage in small, often unnoticed acts. Even as winter continued, subtle signs of hope emerged. Snow melted briefly in sheltered valleys. Wells provided small amounts of water. Animals, though few, survived in hidden corners of forests. These small victories, though fleeting, were reminders that life continued even in the harshest conditions. Every saved grain, every rationed loaf, every shared warmth was a triumph, quiet but profound, against a winter that had taken so much. Thus, castles, clergy, and common folk alike became intertwined in the struggle against frost and hunger. The winter of 1315 was no longer merely a season. It was a slow, living force shaping lands and hearts alike. And through it all, life endured, stubborn, patient, quiet, beneath a pale sun that seemed to watch, distant and indifferent, as the people learned to survive, to share, and to hope in the coldest of times. The year of pale sunlight and relentless frost stretched onward, and it was not confined to any single village, town, or castle. The winter traveled, slowly and unyielding, across lands and rivers, over hills and valleys, until the chill and hunger touched kingdoms far and wide. Each region, though distant, felt the same quiet oppression, as if the frost itself had a mind and a will, moving deliberately, testing the endurance of men and women wherever it fell. In northern regions, the frost arrived early, but now, as 1315 unfolded, even southern fields felt its bite. Vineyards that had produced sweet wine for generations yielded bitter grapes, shriveled and tasteless. Olive groves, cherished in warm valleys, failed to bloom under skies dimmed by a sun too weary to shine. Farmers, who once expected reliable seasons, found themselves at the mercy of frost that did not respect tradition, knowledge, or effort. The rhythm of planting, growing, and harvesting was disrupted, replaced by waiting, watching, and enduring. Travelers, who once moved freely along roads and rivers, found their journeys slowed and fraught with hardship. Horses struggled to pull carts over frozen roads. Rivers, once paths of commerce, now blocked passage with thick ice. Merchants, whose livelihood depended on the movement of goods, adapted with care. Small loads were carried on foot, local trade became essential, and distant markets were abandoned for months at a time. What little was transported was precious, and every successful delivery became a quiet triumph over the winter's cruelty. Alongside the traders, pilgrims journeyed to distant monasteries and churches, seeking guidance, comfort, or miracles in a world grown cold. They walked cautiously across frozen hills and icy streams, often traveling days longer than usual. Each step was measured, each ration of food carefully preserved. The frost tested not only endurance, but faith, as travelers wondered whether their prayers could survive the same hardship that pressed upon their bodies. Yet they pressed on, patient, resilient, and quiet, leaving behind footprints in snow that would soon vanish beneath new layers of ice. Famine, traveling hand in hand with frost, spread across regions with silent inevitability. In England, France, and the Low Countries, villagers whispered of fields that yielded nothing, of livestock that grew thin, of rivers frozen into silence. Food became a currency of careful exchange. Families bartered what little they had, often sacrificing comfort for survival. Markets, once bustling with color and sound, became subdued gatherings where coins clinked softly and goods were scarce. Even small victories, a handful of grain found hidden in a barn, a preserved root dug from frozen soil, were celebrated quietly yet gratefully. In cities, the hardships of winter became visible in the streets. Narrow alleys, usually filled with chatter, were now lined with those seeking warmth, water, or a share of food. Beggars multiplied, their faces thin, their hands trembling from cold. Craftsmen, unable to trade widely, focused on local needs, repairing tools, crafting containers for stored grain, or mending clothing to preserve warmth. Children, though hungry, learned to assist, carrying small bundles of wood, fetching water, or helping their parents tend to the meager stores of food. Survival became a lesson imparted quietly, step by step, day by day. The frost did not distinguish between rich and poor, noble and peasant, young and old. Even kings and queens, though insulated in castles, faced the limits of their power. Granaries dwindled despite careful rationing. Kitchens, staffed with cooks accustomed to abundance, now produced thin meals that barely satisfied hunger. Nobles who had once known feasts and entertainment learned the quiet discipline of rationing. Councils were convened to distribute supplies, to monitor distant villages, and to ensure that no one within the Lord's lands perished unnecessarily. The winter did not forgive, and all were forced to respect its power. Even the clergy, once the steady voice of hope, faced the vast scale of suffering. Monasteries became centers not only of prayer, but of logistics and care. Monks walked across snow-laden fields to deliver food, tending to the needs of the local population. Chroniclers recorded what they saw, noting the measures taken to preserve life, the ingenuity of those who survived, and the quiet endurance of communities that, despite hardship, did not surrender. These manuscripts would survive long after the frost had ended, a testament to human resilience and adaptability. Travelers' tales spread knowledge as quietly as the frost spread cold. A merchant who learned to store grain beneath a hill in one village might teach the same method to another. A family that discovered a way to protect livestock from frost shared their technique with neighbors. Small innovations, passed orally or through letters, helped communities endure. It was in these shared acts, in the slow spread of practical wisdom, that hope persisted despite the relentless winter. The winter also shaped perception. People no longer measured days by the rising of the sun, which was pale and weak, but by the small accomplishments of survival. The thawing of a river, the melting of ice to obtain water, the successful baking of bread, the preservation of a single loaf, these became markers of time and life. Children learned patience. Parents learned ingenuity. Neighbors learned cooperation. The rhythm of the year was no longer determined by seasons, but by endurance, by adaptation, by the careful management of each day. Even in distant lands, where warmth might have been expected, the winter's reach was felt. Reports from travelers spoke of snow in regions that had rarely known it, of crops failing where harvest had been steady, of rivers frozen in temperate valleys. The frost was no longer local, it was continental. It touched everyone, shaping daily life, forcing adaptation, and teaching lessons of patience and resilience across kingdoms, cities, and villages alike. As famine traveled with frost, subtle social changes occurred. Communities strengthened their bonds, realizing that survival depended not on individual wealth, but on collective care. Bartering became a common practice. Families shared firewood, grain, and clothing. Inns and monasteries became safe havens, offering shelter to those in need. Children were educated in practical skills alongside older wisdom, learning how to preserve food, ration supplies, and endure hardship. The winter shaped not only bodies but minds, teaching lessons that would linger long after the frost had ended. Even as hardships multiplied, small joys persisted. The thaw of a stream in a sheltered valley, the discovery of edible roots beneath frozen soil, a loaf of bread preserved from the previous week, these became treasures. In a world where sunlight barely reached the earth, small victories offered warmth to hearts as well as bodies. Laughter, though rare, persisted in whispers, carried quietly from home to home. Thus the winter of 1315 traveled across lands, leaving in its wake a world transformed by frost, hunger, and adaptation. Rivers froze, fields failed, and cities grew quiet under a sun too weak to offer warmth. Yet amidst this, life endured. Men, women, and children adapted. Communities shared and supported one another. Kings and nobles learned humility, and clergy guided hearts and bodies alike. The frost, relentless and traveling, became both teacher and judge, shaping the land and its people with a slow, deliberate hand. And so the year without sunlight pressed onward, touching every corner of Europe, leaving behind frozen landscapes, altered lives, and enduring lessons. The winter had traveled far yet in its wake. It revealed a quiet truth, that even under the harshest frost, under the most relentless hunger, the human spirit endured, patiently, stubbornly, quietly, waiting for the sun that might one day return. As the frost and famine spread across Europe, the people faced another quiet enemy, one as invisible and unyielding as the frozen rivers: sickness. In a year without sunlight, when crops failed and hunger gnawed at bellies and bones, disease traveled swiftly and silently, preying upon the weakened and weary. This was no sudden plague, but a slow, creeping illness that tested the resilience of all, from peasants in villages to nobles in their stone halls. The winter had already stripped the land of abundance. Fields lay bare, rivers were frozen, and forests could provide only a fraction of sustenance. Livestock, too, suffered. Cattle and sheep weakened or perished under frost. The lack of nourishment left men and women vulnerable. Immune to little and too weak to resist what they encountered, they fell ill more easily than in summers past. Fever, chills, and coughing became familiar companions to the frost, weaving quietly through households and villages. In small cottages, parents tried to care for children with gentle hands and careful measures, yet their own strength was limited. Herbs, once used to soothe minor ailments, were scarce. Fires burned low, providing warmth but little comfort against the cold that seemed to seep into every joint and bone. Mothers whispered prayers, fathers tended hearths, and children watched quietly, sensing danger but unable to understand it fully. The sickness was invisible, yet it left marks as surely as frost left icicles on roofs. Monasteries attempted to respond. Clergy, trained in rudimentary medicine and careful observation, provided care as best they could. They brewed herbal infusions, bandaged wounds, and kept the sick warm beneath woolen blankets. Yet even the monks were not immune. Some fell ill themselves, leaving holes in the quiet networks of care that had become so vital. Despite this, monasteries remained central to survival, offering both physical aid and spiritual guidance. Their careful records, written in muted Latin, documented the spread of sickness alongside frost and famine, a chronicle of endurance in a world grown dim. The nobility, accustomed to relative safety, felt the effects of illness in quiet ways. Servants, weakened by hunger, succumbed to fever. Horses grew ill and unable to work. Even the lords and ladies themselves sometimes fell prey to fatigue and disease. Though they had more resources to resist the effects, the harsh winter and scarcity of food left no one untouched. Castles, though fortified against men and wolves, could not guard fully against the invisible, patient hand of sickness. Villages suffered in similar, if quieter ways. Illness moved slowly from household to household, from family to family, leaving exhaustion and despair in its wake. Mothers, who had once been the healers of their homes, found themselves overburdened. Fathers, unable to provide sufficient nourishment, watched helplessly. Children, fragile and small, were especially vulnerable, their laughter now subdued to quiet murmurs as fever crept through their bodies. The frost, famine, and sickness combined into a force that seemed almost deliberate in its cruelty. Travelers, forced to move across icy roads in search of trade or sustenance, also carried illness. A merchant bringing grain from one village could unknowingly spread fever to another. Pilgrims, traveling long distances, sometimes succumbed themselves, leaving others to care for the sick or to continue their journey with worry pressing upon their shoulders. The movement of people became both a lifeline and a risk, a delicate balance between survival and exposure. Despite the hardships, communities found ways to endure. Villagers learned to care for the sick quietly, sharing blankets, tending fires, and rationing what food could be spared. Even small gestures, a spoonful of broth, a woolen scarf, a gentle word, became vital. The frost outside mirrored the quiet vigilance within. Each act of care, though unremarkable in times of plenty, now became heroic in its subtlety. In cities, illness exposed the fragility of human life. Narrow streets and crowded homes allowed fever and cough to travel quickly. Public spaces, once bustling with traders and craftsmen, grew quieter as people avoided gatherings to protect themselves. Those who fell ill often relied on neighbors or monasteries for aid, creating networks of mutual support. Even as sickness took its toll, these networks quietly strengthened the bonds of society, teaching lessons of empathy, patience, and endurance. The clergy, in particular, maintained their role as guides and healers. Priests offered prayers for the sick, performed rites for those weakened by illness, and helped organize care within villages and towns. Monks, with their knowledge of herbs and remedies, became essential in the quiet fight against disease. Their careful documentation, recording symptoms, outcomes, and remedies attempted, created a slow map of the illness, one that would later serve historians seeking to understand this peculiar winter of 1315. The frost, famine, and sickness together shaped daily life profoundly. People no longer marked time by sunlight, which was weak and pale, but by small routines, the care of the sick, the distribution of food, the preservation of warmth. Children learned to move quietly, to help without expectation of reward. Adults adapted to scarcity, illness, and frost with slow ingenuity. Even the simplest acts, stirring a pot of thin soup, repairing a torn garment, or checking on a neighbor, became vital components of survival. Even as illness persisted, small victories occurred. A child might recover after a week of fever. A family could find enough firewood to survive a particularly harsh night. A traveler might reach a monastery with news and provisions. These moments, though fleeting, became anchors of hope in an otherwise unyielding winter. Life endured in increments, in quiet and persistent steps, teaching that even under invisible, patient threats, survival remained possible. In the countryside, the combination of frost and sickness also changed labor. Fields lay fallow, not only because of ice, but because the healthy workforce had dwindled. Villagers rotated duties, tended the sick, and rationed energy as carefully as they rationed food. The rhythm of work and rest slowed, dictated by bodies weakened by hunger, frost, or fever. Even the smallest tasks required deliberate thought and effort. Within castles, similar measures were taken. Kitchens rationed not only for the living, but for those falling ill. Servants divided their labor to ensure the sick received attention without exhausting themselves. Nobles, learning patience and empathy, sometimes participated directly, offering aid and comfort to those under their care. The winter's pressure reshaped relationships, forcing people of all ranks to recognize the fragility and interconnectedness of life. And yet, amid frost, famine, and sickness, life persisted. Communities adapted. Monasteries continued their work. Families shared resources. Children learned resilience. The winter, relentless and unyielding, revealed both the vulnerability and the quiet strength of humanity. Survival became less about abundance and more about endurance, cooperation, and the patience to persist in a world stripped of warmth and comfort. Thus, the silent sickness became another chapter in the story of the year without sunlight. It was invisible, creeping, and patient, yet it could not overcome the resilience of those who endured. Life, fragile and diminished, continued quietly beneath pale light and frost-laden skies. Humanity adapted, learned, and survived, step by slow step, awaiting the eventual return of warmth, sustenance, and light. The winter of 1315 pressed onward, bringing frost, hunger, and illness in equal measure. Yet through it all, the human spirit endured, patient, stubborn, and quiet, preserving both life and hope beneath the pale sun that had forsaken the world. As the winter stretched onward, silent and unyielding, another consequence quietly unfolded across Europe: the movement of people wandering in search of survival. The frost and famine had reshaped life so completely that many families felt compelled to leave the lands they had known for generations. Villages once familiar became traps of scarcity, and the call of distant towns, monasteries, or castles, wherever food or warmth might exist, became impossible to ignore. The roads, frozen and treacherous, bore witness to quiet streams of wanderers. Families traveled with careful preparation. The weak carried on sleds, the young trudged through snow with worn shoes, and the elderly were supported by neighbors or kin. Each step was deliberate. Each journey carried the weight of uncertainty. Travelers shared knowledge along the way. Which villages had stores remaining, which rivers might still flow, which forests could provide roots, berries, or firewood. In this movement, survival was as much about learning as it was about endurance. In towns, the arrival of wanderers became a delicate matter. While many were received with cautious hospitality, others were viewed warily. Food was scarce, warmth limited, and each new arrival represented both hope and threat. Inns and monasteries stretched their provisions carefully, welcoming some while ensuring that their own charges were not left without care. Communities learned subtle balances: kindness tempered with prudence, generosity matched by caution. In this way, trust became a quiet currency of survival. Merchants traveling along frozen roads were particularly cautious. They carried precious cargo, often food or supplies, desperately needed in distant regions. Their journeys were slow and careful, avoiding the worst of ice and snow, navigating through the hushed countryside. Each successful trip was a minor triumph. Each failure could mean loss of both goods and life. Traders exchanged stories along the way, of villages abandoned, of frost deep enough to snap trees, of families surviving against impossible odds. These stories traveled faster than frost, carrying wisdom across lands otherwise silenced by cold. The frost and famine reshaped settlements as well. Villages that could no longer sustain themselves began to empty, homes abandoned under snow-laden roofs. Families migrated toward towns with more resources, monasteries offering care, or fertile lands less affected by ice. These movements were cautious, deliberate, and often slow. Frozen rivers and treacherous hills delayed even the most determined travelers, making every journey a test of patience as much as of strength. Those who remained behind learned to adapt. Houses were consolidated, neighbors sharing walls and warmth. Firewood and provisions were pooled, stretched, and divided. Fields were guarded carefully, livestock sheltered in tighter spaces, and gardens protected under layers of snow and straw. Life became a network of interdependence, as the frost demanded cooperation over individuality. Survival, once a personal matter, became a shared endeavor. The clergy, as ever, played a critical role in guiding both wanderers and those who stayed behind. Monks maintained shelters, provided food and advice, and helped families plan journeys safely. Churches became waypoints along frozen paths, offering refuge and quiet counsel. Through careful observation and recording, the clergy preserved knowledge of which routes were passable, which settlements could provide care, and which areas were too dangerous to enter. In this way, spiritual guidance and practical survival merged into a single, quiet effort. Children, often the most vulnerable, learned patience and caution along with survival. They observed the care with which elders rationed food, the measured movements of families traveling long distances, and the quiet kindness exchanged among neighbors. In these lessons, they learned not only endurance, but empathy and prudence, understanding that survival in a year without sunlight required more than strength. It required wisdom, careful observation, and restraint. Even the nobility observed these patterns, sending messengers and scouts to monitor migrations and the state of distant villages. Reports informed rationing, the distribution of grain, and the protection of trade routes. Castles, though insulated, depended on the health and cooperation of surrounding villages. Without the labor of peasants and the movement of merchants, stores would dwindle, and even the most fortified halls could not provide for themselves indefinitely. The frost, unyielding and impartial, made all members of society aware of their dependence on one another. The frost also reshaped trust and social interaction. Communities learned to observe newcomers carefully, offering help while ensuring that resources were preserved. Families shared meals, firewood, and information, but always with awareness of scarcity. Inns and monasteries carefully monitored the number of visitors and distributed provisions in measured amounts. Every decision was influenced by the frost, the famine, and the subtle threat of sickness, creating a quiet tension in daily life that demanded patience and careful thought. Travelers' tales brought both hope and caution. One village might report the discovery of hidden grain in a barn. Another might describe a frozen river that had blocked access for weeks. Merchants and wanderers learned to exchange this information cautiously, balancing the need for survival with the risk of spreading illness or scarcity. These stories, slow to travel but vital, became a quiet web of intelligence that sustained communities despite the harsh winter. In towns, social structures adapted subtly. Families that had previously lived separately merged for mutual support. Neighborhoods pooled resources, dividing firewood and grain according to careful calculations. Young adults assisted elders in daily tasks. Children helped with chores they had never undertaken before. The frost forced cooperation in ways that would have seemed unnecessary in warmer times, creating interdependence that slowly reshaped social bonds. The winter's pressure also altered perception of wealth and necessity. Nobles and merchants learned the limits of their influence. Peasants discovered the quiet power of shared labor and knowledge. Food, fire, and warmth became more important than coin or title. Even the smallest acts, sharing a loaf of bread, providing shelter for a traveler, tending to the sick, carried profound significance. The frost and famine, though harsh, revealed the essential value of community and endurance. Even as the frost pressed further into the southern lands, families adjusted, moving slowly and carefully, seeking regions where survival was more probable. Some journeys took weeks, others months. Travelers learned to conserve energy, ration food, and avoid unnecessary exposure to ice and snow. Villages along the paths of these wanderers learned to balance caution with charity, welcoming some while guarding their resources carefully. Each interaction was measured, deliberate, and quietly consequential. The frost's reach continued, yet even as it pressed on, subtle signs of life persisted. Streams beneath snow sometimes thawed, allowing water for survival. Hidden roots and hardy herbs offered nourishment. Small victories, though fleeting, were celebrated quietly, as proof that life could endure even under relentless winter. Each successful journey, each preserved meal, each act of care became a thread connecting communities, sustaining hearts as well as bodies. Thus, the winter of 1315, traveling silently across the lands, reshaped the human experience. Movement became a necessity, caution a virtue, and cooperation a survival strategy. Families wandered, merchants traveled carefully, and communities adapted to preserve life and warmth. Even as frost, famine, and sickness pressed relentlessly, humanity endured, quietly, patiently, and stubbornly, relying on wisdom, endurance, and shared effort to navigate a year that seemed to have forgotten the sun. The frost and famine, traveling hand in hand, transformed both the landscape and society. Villages merged, roads became cautious corridors of survival, monasteries and inns served as lifelines, and every step forward became a deliberate act of persistence. The wandering and the wary marked a quiet chapter in the history of Europe, one where survival depended not on abundance, but on patience, prudence, and the slow cultivation of trust. In this muted world, life continued beneath frozen skies, teaching a quiet lesson that would echo through generations. That endurance, careful observation, and cooperation were as essential as warmth or food, that even in the harshest winter, humanity could adapt, survive, and persist, waiting for the sun that might one day return. As the year without sunlight pressed on, there came, slowly and almost imperceptibly, a change in the frozen lands. The frost, which had held dominion over fields, rivers, and villages, began to loosen its grip in scattered whispers. It was not a sudden thaw, nor a joyful return of warmth, but a quiet easing, subtle and delicate, noticed only by those who had endured long months of ice and hunger. In villages, the snow began to soften in sheltered corners, forming small rivulets of water that trickled silently beneath frozen crusts. Farmers observed with careful attention, recognizing that this might signal the possibility of planting once more, though still cautious of sudden frost. Children who had long grown accustomed to the monotony of snow-covered fields noticed the faint shimmer of water beneath ice and played quietly along its edges, slipping cautiously on softened crusts and observing the tiny movements of winter's slow retreat. The thaw was tentative. Rivers, long frozen into glassy silence, began to trickle in narrow channels where the ice was weakest. Bridges, previously encased in frost, showed the faint gleam of flowing water beneath. Travelers, cautious but hopeful, resumed slow journeys along routes that had been impossible for months. Merchants measured their steps carefully, carrying goods that had been stockpiled in anticipation of better conditions, while families began to consider the possibility of returning from temporary migrations. Monasteries were among the first to recognize signs of recovery. Gardens, long buried beneath snow, revealed patches of earth softened by thaw, allowing herbs and hardy vegetables to push through. Wells, previously frozen solid, offered small amounts of water, encouraging the careful collection and rationing of what could sustain life. Monks walked quietly through these spaces, noting subtle changes, and began to adjust their plans, preserving seeds, tending to livestock, and preparing for the slow renewal of food stores. The thaw brought hope, but also caution. The frost had not yet fully retreated, and sudden freezes could strike again at any time. Families remained vigilant, protecting crops, monitoring livestock, and keeping fires burning in homes and cottages. Even as the ice loosened its grip, the lessons of endurance remained essential. People knew that the winter's cruelty had not yet fully relinquished its power. Survival depended still on prudence, careful rationing, and shared effort. In towns, the thaw allowed small signs of commerce to re-emerge. Market stalls, once quiet and sparse, began to display limited goods, preserved roots, dried herbs, salted meat. Traders returned cautiously from nearby villages, carrying items that had been impossible to transport across frozen roads. The clinking of coins and the faint murmurs of trade were small but welcome changes, signaling that life might slowly regain rhythm, though still tempered by caution. The frost's retreat also allowed social connections to mend. Families who had been separated by temporary migration began to reunite, traveling along thawed paths with careful attention to lingering ice and weak roads. Children saw cousins and neighbors again. Elders exchanged news and provisions, and communities quietly rebuilt bonds that had been strained by scarcity and isolation. Even the simplest gestures, a shared meal, the exchange of firewood, or a helping hand across a muddy path, took on greater significance after months of separation. The clergy, as always, guided this cautious renewal. Monks advised farmers on planting strategies suited to the slow return of warmth, distributed seeds, and monitored livestock carefully. Priests offered prayers of gratitude, while reminding villagers to continue their careful watchfulness, teaching that patience and caution remained virtues even as hope emerged. Churches became centers not only of faith, but of practical planning, coordinating resources, and supporting families returning from migration. Children noticed the thaw in small ways, the softening of snow underfoot, the trickle of water from icicles, the faint stirrings of birds that had returned. These subtle signs brought quiet joy, though tempered by awareness of remaining cold. They learned, once again, that change was gradual, that patience was necessary, and that hope must be nurtured carefully, like the small seedlings just pushing through the softened soil. Even the nobility observed the subtle changes, sending scouts and messengers to monitor lands and villages. Granaries were inventoried, stores of firewood measured, and the first cautious planting began in sheltered areas. Lords and ladies recognized that abundance would not return quickly, but the thaw allowed slow preparation for the eventual return of stability. Castles remained vigilant, but the quiet signs of renewal offered reassurance that their efforts and foresight were beginning to bear fruit. Merchants, too, cautiously resumed activity. Frozen roads gave way to softened paths, allowing sleds and carts to carry small loads of grain, salt, and dried goods. Travelers shared news of distant regions where thaw had arrived earlier, offering hope and guidance. Communities listened carefully, weighing the value of each journey against the risks of lingering frost or illness. Knowledge, accumulated over months of hardship, now guided cautious recovery, shaping choices with the wisdom of endurance. The thaw did not erase the lessons of frost and famine. Villages remained scarred, fields were depleted, and families were leaner from months of scarcity. Yet the quiet emergence of flowing water, softened soil, and the faint warmth of sun brought the first possibilities of renewal. People prepared cautiously, repairing homes damaged by ice, clearing snow-bound paths, and tending livestock whose survival had been uncertain. Each small act of preparation became both practical and symbolic, a step toward reclaiming life from winter's grasp. The slow thaw also reshaped perception. Where once survival had depended on endurance alone, now attention turned to preparation and planning. Children learned to care for seedlings. Elders instructed younger generations in rationing, and communities coordinated the distribution of food and labor. Even the smallest signs of life, a sprouting root, the return of birds, a flowing stream, were lessons in patience, observation, and careful optimism. As the thaw progressed, families cautiously experimented with planting. Fields, though still partially frozen, were worked with care, seeds pressed gently into softened earth. Gardens within village yards were tended with renewed attention. Livestock grazed on patches of softened grass, and small foraging parties ventured into nearby forests to collect herbs, roots, and berries. Each success, however modest, was a quiet triumph, reinforcing the slow rhythm of life that had been disrupted for so long. Even in distant towns, the thaw allowed subtle social recovery. Inns reopened to weary travelers, providing shelter and warm meals. Merchants resumed limited trade, exchanging preserved goods and sharing news of conditions elsewhere. Communities cautiously welcomed returnees from villages and remote regions, balancing hospitality with prudence. The frost's lingering threat demanded continued vigilance, but the whispers of thaw allowed small signs of normalcy to emerge. The slow return of warmth also brought hope to the sick. Those weakened by months of hunger and illness began to recover more steadily as nutrition improved and fires burned steadily in homes and monasteries. Careful attention to hygiene, warmth, and diet allowed recovery where previously it had been uncertain. Children regained color and strength, parents felt less exhaustion, and even the elderly began to move with slightly more ease. Thus, the winter of 1315, though not yet ended, began to release its hold in scattered whispers of thaw. Frost still lingered, rivers remained partly frozen, and scarcity persisted, but life had begun to find pathways through the ice. Communities adapted, families reunited, travelers cautiously resumed movement, and small victories quietly accumulated across the frozen lands. The thaw, subtle and slow, taught new lessons, that recovery is gradual, that patience is as vital as endurance, and that hope, when nurtured carefully, can emerge even after the harshest of winters. Humanity, shaped by frost, famine, and illness, now discovered that renewal required attention, prudence, and care, a quiet continuation of the lessons learned under months of relentless frost. Even as the frost receded in small, careful increments, life remained deliberate and slow. Each day required mindful observation, careful rationing, and shared effort. The pale sun, though still weak, hinted at the eventual return of warmth and abundance. Communities, shaped by months of struggle, now prepared for the subtle possibilities of growth, holding fast to the knowledge that endurance and caution would continue to be essential. And so, beneath softened snow and slowly flowing rivers, Europe began to breathe once more. The frost, though still present, no longer dominated. Life, cautious and deliberate, continued beneath the pale sun, learning that recovery is a slow, patient process, shaped by observation, cooperation, and the quiet determination of those who had endured the year without sunlight. Even as the frost lingered in scattered valleys and the sun remained pale, the year of suffering began to show the earliest signs of life returning. The thaw had arrived, tentative and fragile, yet it brought with it the first whispers of spring. This was not a season of sudden renewal, but a gradual stirring, delicate and quiet, unfolding in hidden corners of villages, fields, and forests. Farmers, long constrained by snow and ice, observed cautiously. Soil softened under the thaw, and tiny green shoots pushed tentatively through dark, moist earth. Seeds, planted in careful preparation during brief intervals of warmth, began to swell and break open. Even the smallest signs of growth were treated with reverent attention. A sprout emerging from frost-bound soil was observed, nurtured, and protected as if it were the most precious treasure. The frost, though still present in shaded hollows, no longer entirely ruled the land. Villages slowly resumed routines, shaped by the possibility of growth. Paths that had been snowed over were cleared carefully, allowing for travel between households, fields, and communal wells. Livestock grazed on patches of softened grass, finding sustenance that had been absent for months. Families repaired homes damaged by frost, reinforced roofs, and rebuilt fences that had been broken under ice and snow. Each act of repair, each cautious venture outdoors, became a small triumph over the winter's lingering dominion. Monasteries played a quiet but vital role in this recovery. Monks tended gardens with careful attention, preserving seeds and planting herbs, vegetables, and flowers that could withstand residual frost. Wells were cleared and checked for safe water. Monasteries became quiet centers of knowledge, offering guidance to villagers eager to restore their own lands. The clergy encouraged patience, reminding all that even as spring stirred, frost could return unexpectedly, and careful observation remained essential. Travelers and merchants resumed movement more confidently. Roads softened by thaw allowed carts and sleds to carry food, firewood, and tools. Traders shared knowledge of which regions had successful planting, where rivers had begun to flow freely, and which towns could provide shelter or supplies. Even short journeys required caution, yet the movement of people and goods signaled a gradual return of rhythm to a land that had been silenced by frost, famine, and sickness. Children, more resilient than adults realized, noticed the subtle changes in ways that brought quiet joy. They observed the first insects emerging, the faint hum of bees from sheltered hives, and the gradual greening of moss and lichen. Birds returned to the sky and treetops, their calls soft yet persistent, carrying a promise of continuity and renewal. These signs, though modest, were celebrated with quiet delight, teaching children that life endures even under the harshest of winters. In towns, social bonds strengthened as communities collaborated in preparation for early planting. Families worked together to repair irrigation ditches, clear frozen debris from gardens, and organize labor to protect vulnerable crops. Food, still scarce, was rationed carefully to allow workers the strength to tend the land. Children assisted by fetching water, carrying tools, or preparing small plots for planting. Each action, however simple, reinforced the quiet rhythm of shared survival that had been cultivated over the long winter. Nobility, too, observed the first signs of spring with careful attention. Lords sent scouts to evaluate conditions across their lands, noting which fields could be sown immediately and which would require further protection. Granaries were inventoried, and small reserves of seed and fodder were distributed prudently. Castles remained cautious. While the frost had retreated from some regions, shaded valleys and highlands retained ice, reminding all that vigilance was still necessary. Even as planting resumed, the memory of famine and sickness lingered. Villagers recalled the months when food had been scarce, when illness had spread quietly, and when frost had ruled without mercy. These memories shaped behavior, fostering prudence, cooperation, and careful observation. Crops were planted with attention to the smallest details, livestock tended with care, and communities worked to ensure that no loss could undo the fragile hope that had begun to emerge. Merchants, traveling along thawed roads, carried both practical goods and news. Reports of successful planting encouraged distant villages, while tales of lingering frost or disease warned travelers to exercise caution. Inns and monasteries welcomed weary wanderers with careful hospitality, providing food, shelter, and advice. Knowledge of regional conditions became a shared treasure, reinforcing the quiet networks of communication that had developed during the winter. The clergy continued to guide this cautious renewal. Monks recorded the timing of thaws, the first signs of plant growth, and the return of wildlife. Priests advised communities on safe planting and care of the sick, combining spiritual guidance with practical counsel. Churches became hubs of both faith and practical preparation, offering quiet support as families ventured once more into fields that had been idle for months. Even in remote regions, subtle signs of life returned. Forests yielded new shoots and tender roots. Rivers flowed in patches where ice had cracked, and animals emerged from hidden shelters. Hunters and gatherers ventured carefully, collecting food to supplement limited stores. Each small success, whether a recovered child, a patch of edible greens, or a thawed river providing water, became a quiet triumph, reminding communities that the frost was receding and that life could continue. The thaw also reshaped social perception. Where abundance had once defined wealth, now knowledge, prudence, and cooperation held greater value. Children learned practical skills alongside lessons of endurance, planting, foraging, rationing, and caring for the weak. Adults shared labor and resources with careful attention, understanding that collective effort ensured survival. Even the nobility recognized the limits of status in the face of frost and famine, valuing practical wisdom over inherited wealth. Families cautiously expanded gardens, sowing early vegetables and tending seedlings with care. Livestock were monitored for signs of weakness, and small shelters were constructed to protect both animals and people from unexpected frosts. Villagers observed and adapted to the rhythms of thaw, measuring soil moisture, noting river flow, and predicting potential freezes. Each observation informed decisions, allowing communities to act deliberately in ways that promoted recovery and sustained life. Travelers noted the first signs of renewed trade. Roads previously impassable were cleared, allowing for the slow movement of goods. Merchants, cautious yet hopeful, carried seeds, salt, dried meat, and other essentials to towns and villages. Knowledge of fertile areas, safe paths, and available resources traveled quietly along these routes, knitting communities together in careful anticipation of a return to more normal life. Even as spring stirred, caution remained. Frost still lingered in shaded valleys. Rivers remained partly frozen, and illness persisted quietly among weakened populations. Yet the subtle signs of life, seedlings emerging, flowing streams, the return of birds, offered reassurance. Communities learned that recovery was neither immediate nor complete, but that deliberate observation, careful action, and shared effort allowed gradual restoration of both land and life. Thus, the year without sunlight moved slowly toward renewal. Frost receded in patches. Rivers flowed where ice had held them, and plants pushed through softened soil. Villages and towns cautiously resumed work, families reunited, and travelers ventured forth along previously frozen paths. Life, shaped by months of endurance, adapted once more, learning that the first stirrings of spring demanded patience, attention, and careful nurturing of hope. The frost, though diminished, still served as a reminder of the past hardships. Communities remembered the months of scarcity, illness, and isolation, carrying forward lessons of prudence and cooperation. Children, observing the earliest shoots and the faint warmth of the sun, learned that even in the harshest winters, life could endure and slowly recover. In this delicate balance between lingering frost and emerging warmth, humanity discovered a quiet truth: that recovery is gradual, that hope must be nurtured with patience, and that life, though fragile, can endure even under the most relentless winters. The first stirring of spring was neither sudden nor dramatic, but it carried a promise that, after months of endurance, the world could slowly reclaim its rhythm. And so, beneath softened snow, flowing rivers, and a pale yet steady sun, Europe prepared for cautious renewal. Communities rebuilt, fields were sown, and the human spirit, tempered by frost, famine, and illness, discovered that patience, cooperation, and careful attention could guide the slow return of life beneath skies still hesitant to shine. The frost of 1315, having reigned with quiet persistence for many months, gradually loosened its grip on the lands of Europe. Rivers that had been frozen in silence began to flow more freely. Fields, though still weary from the weight of ice and famine, revealed patches of soil softened by thaw, ready to nurture the first cautious crops of the season. Life, patient and deliberate, began to reclaim the rhythm that had been suspended under months of relentless winter. Villages emerged from isolation. Families reunited after temporary migrations. Children saw friends and cousins again, and elders exchanged news, stories, and carefully rationed provisions. Houses damaged by ice and frost were repaired, thatched roofs reinforced, and fences rebuilt to protect both livestock and crops. The slow movement of life across thawed paths mirrored the gradual emergence of hope within hearts long accustomed to scarcity. Even the smallest gestures carried significance. A mother sharing bread with a neighbor, a father guiding a child along softened roads, a family offering shelter to a weary traveler. These quiet acts, previously ordinary, now took on profound meaning. In every corner, the lessons of endurance, prudence, and shared effort were evident, woven into the daily lives of those who had survived months of hardship. Monasteries continued to guide and document this subtle renewal. Monks recorded the progress of thaw, the success of early planting, and the return of wildlife to lands long subdued by frost. Herbal gardens, planted carefully in preparation for recovery, began to flourish in sheltered plots. Wells, long frozen, provided clear water once more. Monasteries served not only as centers of faith, but as quiet hubs of knowledge, offering guidance in planting, preservation, and community care. The clergy reminded communities that caution was still necessary. Frost lingered in shaded valleys, illness persisted quietly among the weak, and food remained limited. Yet even as reminders of hardship endured, the gradual return of warmth allowed preparation for more sustained growth and stability. Patience, long practiced during the harsh months, became a guiding principle of the delicate renewal. Farmers, their hands hardened by months of labor, cautiously resumed planting. Seeds were sown into softened soil, and small plots were tended with careful attention. Livestock grazed on patches of emerging grass, protected from sudden freezes by improvised shelters and vigilant watch. Every successful sprout, every recovered animal, and every replenished store of food was a quiet triumph, reinforcing the slow but deliberate restoration of life. Travelers and merchants resumed movement with measured optimism. Roads, once impassable, now allowed the cautious transport of goods. Inns reopened, providing shelter, warmth, and nourishment. Merchants exchanged news of distant regions, carrying knowledge of successful planting, lingering frost, and local conditions. This information, shared carefully and deliberately, strengthened networks of survival and preparation, knitting communities together in ways that the frost had previously forced them to imagine. Children, observing these changes, learned lessons of resilience and attentiveness. They noticed the return of birds, the first stirrings of insects, and the subtle greening of moss, lichen, and early shoots. These small signs of life offered reassurance and a quiet promise of continuity. Children practiced patience, learning that growth, recovery, and survival were processes to be nurtured slowly and deliberately. Even the nobility remained vigilant. Lords and ladies oversaw careful allocation of resources, monitored granaries, and evaluated the readiness of fields and livestock. While the frost had eased, shaded valleys and higher lands still carried ice. Castles, though fortified, relied on the health and cooperation of surrounding villages. Every decision, from the distribution of seeds to the care of livestock, was influenced. by months of careful observation and measured patience. The thaw and early spring brought subtle celebrations. Villagers marked the first flowing streams, the first sprouting fields, and the cautious return of trade with quiet acknowledgement. These were not festivals of abundance, but acknowledgments of endurance and the slow reclamation of life from winter's grasp. Laughter, soft and subdued, returned in small doses, carried across thawing roads, village paths, and monastery gardens. The frost's retreat revealed the quiet strength of communities. Families that had shared firewood, food, and labor during the harsh months now continued to cooperate in preparation for planting and harvesting. Labor was shared between neighbors. Children assisted elders, and knowledge of survival, gathered slowly through months of hardship, guided careful action. Trust, nurtured by necessity, became a vital thread connecting lives across villages and towns. Health, slowly returning with improved nutrition, allowed communities to rebuild. Those weakened by hunger and illness gradually regained strength. Children, nurtured by attentive care, returned to playful routines. Adults resumed the measured rhythm of work and observation, and elders shared wisdom accumulated through both hardship and survival. The human body and spirit, tested by frost, famine, and sickness, began to reclaim vitality in small but meaningful increments. Even in remote areas, life returned cautiously. Forests yielded early shoots, streams flowed steadily, and animals ventured from hidden shelters. Hunters and gatherers once again collected food to supplement cultivated crops. Every successful hunt or gathered root became a quiet triumph, evidence that life could persist and recover even after months of relentless winter. The lessons of the year without sunlight remained central to behavior. Communities continued to ration carefully, observe cautiously, and work cooperatively. Knowledge of safe routes, fertile soil, and resource availability guided decision-making. Children, learning these practices, understood that survival was built upon patience, attention, and shared effort, not only abundance. Merchants, carrying goods and news, reinforced these lessons. Small shipments of preserved food, tools, and seeds traveled along cleared roads, connecting distant villages and towns. Each journey, carefully measured and timed, ensured that scarce resources were used wisely and effectively. These networks of cautious commerce fostered a quiet sense of continuity and shared purpose. The frost, though diminished, remained a reminder of past hardship. It lingered in shaded hollows and highlands, a quiet teacher of caution. Communities, mindful of this, acted deliberately, protecting crops, livestock, and stores of food. Even the smallest signs of life, a sprout, a thawed stream, a returning bird, were met with careful attention and measured optimism. The pale sun, which had abandoned the world for so many months, now offered faint warmth and lengthened days. Its presence, though subtle, guided planting, travel, and daily work. Life adjusted once more to its rhythms, mindful of Viboth, the lessons of hardship, and the possibilities of renewal. Communities observed, acted, and waited, learning that recovery is a slow and deliberate process. In quiet reflection, people considered the year that had passed. Frost, famine, and sickness had tested endurance, cooperation, and patience. Villages had adapted, families had endured, and communities had learned the quiet power of shared effort. Even in hardship, small acts, tending a seedling, caring for a neighbor, recording observations in a monastery, had carried profound significance. The first stirrings of spring, gentle and deliberate, marked the beginning of a slow reclamation of life. Seeds planted in softened soil, livestock fed and tended, and communities cooperating cautiously reflected the quiet resilience of humanity. The frost, though diminished, remained a teacher. The famine, though passing, left lessons in prudence. The sickness, though receding, reminded all of vulnerability. Yet life, deliberate and patient, persisted. Thus, beneath the pale sun, Europe slowly emerged from its long winter. Fields were sown, rivers flowed, children played, and families reunited. Communities rebuilt, relying on knowledge gained from months of hardship. The frost of 1315 had retreated, yet its lessons endured. Humanity, tempered by endurance, cooperation, and patient observation, learned that survival is not immediate but cultivated gradually through care, attention, and quiet perseverance. The year without sunlight, though harsh and relentless, had revealed the remarkable resilience of life. Beneath softened snow, thawed rivers, and faint sunlight, the human spirit endured. Communities rebuilt cautiously, crops emerged slowly, and hope, nurtured through patience and shared effort, returned quietly yet persistently. And so, in the final reflections beneath the pale sun, the world understood the slow and deliberate rhythms of endurance, adaptation, and recovery. The frost was no longer master, the famine diminished, and sickness receded. Life continued, deliberate and careful, guided by the wisdom of hardship, the patience of survival, and the quiet determination of those who had endured the year without sunlight.